whole school approach to inclusive education in Ireland. So I suppose in terms of the context and focus of this presentation, Ireland has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability in 2018. There's National Council for Special Education policy advice in terms of moving towards a progressive realization of a fully inclusive system. The disability strategy in Ireland aligns with the aspirations around the UN CRPD and European agencies' advice in terms of supporting us to move towards a more inclusive system. This is really timely because, unfortunately, we have a major disconnect between our policy aspirations in terms of inclusive education and the current policy practice in increasing separate provision in the system. So whereas traditionally Ireland, possibly over a good 40-year period, had about 2% of its student population in separate provision between special schools and classes, we are now heading over the next few years to a figure of 5% in separate provision, which is an increase at an alarming rate. So I suppose the key question in terms of the mainstream school general education system is how can resources be best used at a whole school level to address the diversity of strengths and needs of children and young people. So I'm going to draw on some theoretical ideas, conceptual, and then some Irish empirical data, particularly Irish empirical data, to address this issue. So in terms of what you might call traditional approaches to in response to diversity, there's two main ones. One is a one size fits all, or what has been called in the literature monistic spatial fusion, where systems stretch maybe to varying degrees to include those within a normalized perspective, with an emphasis on access to largely unchanged systems or relations. The second is probably more common, is where we create parallel structures, systems, classifications, categories that become like a safety valve for the general system to allow it to kind of go on largely unchanged. And this you could refer to as the continuum of provision. In terms of a theoretical analysis of this, which myself and a colleague, Paul Downs, did, we termed this diametric oppositional spaces. So this idea of the continuum of provision as an underlying assumption driving the system, we think needs to be critiqued further. And there has been critique of this. For example, Taylor identified the following problems with the continuum. It legitimizes restrictive environments. It confuses segregation with intensity of services. It's based on the idea that people must be ready for inclusion. It supports the dominance of decisions made by professionals. It provides a sanctioning of infringement of fundamental human rights. It's based on an inherent requirement that people earn the right to move. And it directs attention towards physical settings and not towards the services and support required to thrive within the community. So taking that continuum, even within the general education system, there are many examples of what we call diametric oppositional spatial thinking. Now, what we mean by that are distinctions that are possibly unhelpful in terms of a coordinated service. So these include the distinctions we make between mainstream classes and special classes, between special education teachers and class and subject teachers. And as we saw in the earlier discussion, often validated by separate initial teacher education. We have distinctions around student identity and ability, children with and without special educational needs, leading to essentialist views, low expectations. We have distinctions in relation to pedagogy, special pedagogy, inclusive pedagogy. Elizabeth Walton makes the really good point that when inclusive education is mapped onto strongly classified education systems, limited instantiations of inclusive education are inevitable, and difference and exclusion are reinscribed. Simone spoke earlier about the rhetoric of inclusive education being ascribed to segregated systems. So how do we break down these barriers and distinctions that constrain creative responses to diversity in the system? So an alternative perspective is required for inclusive education. And with my colleague, we propose a key thinking behind what we call a conceptual spatial turn to reconceptualize inclusive and special education as relational and connective, moving beyond traditional oppositional and exclusionary spatial systems. So this approach challenges diametric spatial systems, which are characterized by assumed separation, rigid hierarchies, mirror image oppositions, us, them, norm, other. Instead, concentric spatial systems emphasize connection, relative openness, relational unity, allowing for distinction within connection. So it's not a one size fits all. It allows for distinction within connection. Ricks et al. In a very what I would term under-referenced report for the National Council for Special Education in 2013 suggests a shift in thinking and practice from a continuum of provision of 6 overarching categories to a community of provision. And I think this is a much more powerful metaphor and framework for conceptualizing how we use space and resourcing in schools. So their concept of the community of provision includes community space concerned with where support takes place, community staffing, community of students, community support, looking at the quantity and type of support, community strategies concerned with the quality of the support, community systems concerned with issues of governance and accountability and tracking and monitoring. Okay, so I think this to move from a continuum of provision structure or framework to a community of provision, I think would allow for a lot more creative and cohesive responses. So what are the implications of that for inclusive education? To have this more concentric community of provision approach. So in terms of physical spaces, schools are envisaged as multiple interconnected spaces with, for example, nurture rooms, sensory rooms, garden spaces, silent spaces, shared campuses, rather than homogeneous or segregated environments. So it moves the focus of inclusion, not just in the mainstream class, but to the wider school and to a plurality of different spaces that can be used based on need and not on category of disability. Curriculum and pedagogy, inclusive teaching practices are designed to account for diverse needs and the variability from the beginning, emphasizing relational and universal design approaches, individually relevant learning. Assessment, a plurality of assessment methods, criterion reference, ipsative assessment, where children are assessed against their own progress, is used to capture diverse progress and engagement, moving beyond norm reference standardized models. Collaboration, health and education systems are integrated, breaking down silos, fostering multidisciplinary work, a huge challenge in the Irish system. Leadership, inclusive leadership, absolutely vital, focuses on solidarity, connection, shared responsibility, challenging hierarchical power dynamics. So in terms of the Irish system, what sort of challenges do we have to confront? So whole school response can be disrupted by the disconnect between the continuum of support policy and the continuum of provision policy, with different funding models, as was mentioned earlier, that can result in push and pull factors for separate provision. So because you have that disconnect, it creates an impetus towards more separate provision. There's a distinction then between the roles of the special education teacher and the special class teacher within the one school, and their relationships with class and subject teachers within the one school, which potentially acts as a barrier to a whole school response to supporting more inclusive practices. Movement along the continuum is in one direction, with an alarming increase in separate provision from an early age, in some cases age 4. There's some evidence of fear and lack of leadership militating against prioritization and use of resources and inclusive models of support emerging. So principals are nervous of using the autonomy that is actually present in the allocation model to prioritize resources or even to take risks for inclusion. There's evidence of barriers to collaboration around attitudes, practices, and availability of non-contact time for planning. Higgins' study looked at 50 primary SET teachers and explored their views and beliefs around co-teaching and collaboration. And we have evidence from the department inspector of some misuse of resources given to schools in relation to inclusive education. So a key question then, is the autonomy around deployment being used to promote inclusive education? And what further measures are required to ensure this? I mentioned earlier, we have the alarming increase in separate provision. Some of this is in an increase in special schools. And unfortunately, a lot of those special schools are not even being co-located on shared campuses. But we also have a huge increase in special classes, and over 87% of those classes are autism classes only. That model has poor rationale, poor evidence base, and is really not sustainable in the system. There is some evidence that the special class model can be evolved to be a more inclusive space. So the history of the special class provision in Ireland, particularly around special classes for travellers, special classes for children with mild general learning disabilities, did change over time and led to a building of capacity to respond differently. Flanagan, in the Irish context, again, in a case study of 3 schools, used a shared planning tool for the teachers and special needs assistants used. So the special class teacher and the class teacher used the tool along with the assistants. And it increased both the quantity and quality of inclusion in mainstream classes from the special class for autistic students with severe intellectual disabilities. So again, a big key question for us is, how can this space, which is a valuable space to have, the teacher resource, the special needs assistant resources, be utilized differently, more collaboratively, inclusively? And you could argue that ultimately we need a more sophisticated model of support that is unified, that breaks down that distinction, as I said, between the continuum of support and continuum of provision model. So this model of support that's unified, it's important that it does not incentivize separate provision based on disability categorization. Teacher collaboration for inclusive education again, is highlighted in the literature as central to implementing inclusive education, and Irish findings reiterate that. In Higgins' study of the 50 teachers, she found that the SCT's collaboration with their colleagues tended to be informal in nature, was highly dependent on personality issues and the quality of the professional working relationships. Issues of professional confidence, respect, trust, and betrayal came to the fore, and the fear of conflict proved a strong disincentive to the joint evaluations of team-taught lessons. So going back to Simone's point about the trusting, collaborative culture, that's really, 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 really important. What does a whole school approach entail? Leadership for inclusive education. Spillane of distributed leadership fame argues that leaders require a design mindset rather than an implementation mindset. So it's a forward-looking, experimental design-based approach where you're willing to try different things and evaluate and see how they work. Morrissey emphasizes the importance of inclusive values in leadership for inclusive education. A culture of shared commitment and responsibility, getting back to our community of provision, collaborative shared planning and teaching, dedicated non-contact time, that's an issue in the Irish system, within, between, beyond schools, working with health professionals, a human rights strengths-based perspective. When we look at some of the narrative still in Ireland, it's still characterized by a charity deficit focused approach, a shared team solution focused approach. Think of the energy that can be released when you're just looking for solutions and not looking to move a child on to the out of the school, for example. Commitment to teacher professional learning, partnership with parents and other professionals, and the use of learning communities in schools. So we know the importance of initial teacher education, but it can only do so much. The continuing professional learning for teachers embedded in their context, where they're trusted to identify the priorities that are required at a whole school level, and crucially, including special needs assistance in that whole school conversation, something that doesn't happen at present in the Irish context. A whole school approach to socio-emotional development and a focus on well-being, an emphasis on involving fellow students. So it's a community of students as well for support, connection with the wider class, social skills teaching. Systematic monitoring of student progress involving assessment for and of learning, including student voice. And as we mentioned earlier, inclusive pedagogy, universal design for learning, but with flexibility to adapt for individual needs. I include the references there, and Gormila Mahagwith, or thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion on those challenges for the Irish system. Thank you very much.